Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. This episode is sponsored by Annapolis Pediatrics. For more than 70 years, Annapolis Pediatrics has provided exceptional health care to infants, children, adolescents, and young adults in Annapolis and the surrounding communities. They have over 30 physicians and nurse practitioners to serve your family, and now in 6 locations: Annapolis, Crofton, Edgewater, Severna Park, Kent Island, and Pasadena. Learn more about Annapolis Pediatrics and find helpful parenting resources, videos, and more at annapolispediatrics.com. Today on Third Floor Views, we are talking about local birds and birding with kids. And joining us is Marc Parnell, author of the Birding Pros Field Guide series, Birds of Maryland, which was released by Naturalist and Traveler Press just this spring, and it has now hit multiple bestseller lists. So thank you so much, Marc, for joining me today.
So excited to join.
To our viewers, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat section and we'll get to those as we can. So, Marc, let's get started. So first, if you could just tell us a little bit about your book, Birds of Maryland, and how it's different from other field guides, because it is, which is really exciting. And it just speak a little bit about how best to use your guide.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, Janet. So my book, Birds of Maryland, features the 140 most common species to the state of Maryland. So those are the ones that you'll be able to find pretty readily in your parks, on your coastlines, your ponds, your fields, your woods. And each species provides a detailed day in the life account of each species behavior. So essentially, it's the behavioral backstory, a day in the life of what each bird is doing when you might not be able to see it just around the corner or sheltered by some brush or leaves. In addition, this is actually the first ever book to include monthly birding forecasts for every single species. Now, this essentially tells you what time of year, and specifically which months of the year, each bird is most likely to be observed, or essentially an ease of use index. And this essentially will be able to tell you that some species, like the dark-eyed junco, might be more observable in the winter, and other species, such as the eastern meadowlark, might be a little bit more observable in the summertime. So that's a really handy reference when you're finding certain species that you really particularly enjoy and want to be able to go out and find them in the field. Or if you're just double checking an observation, you think maybe I saw this species outside. Maybe I saw a gray catbird, when in reality it was December and gray catbirds typically aren't quite as much in Maryland at that time of year. So it's a nice double check reference. In addition, not many field guides, if very few field guides in general, actually include bird feeding guides for every species likely to visit your feeders. So any bird that could possibly visit your backyard feeders, I have a detailed bird feeding guide for each of those species, and that includes the foods they're most likely to enjoy or seek out, as well as the feeders they most typically frequent. For instance, the mourning dove likes platforms and likes to feed on the ground, but it really can't fit its large, bulky body on a skinny little tube feeder. So these are important things to know when you're first starting out and shopping for feeders and thinking, I really want to find the dove, and then you're disappointed and you can't quite find him because he's not coming to your specific variety of feeder.
Right, right.
And then in addition, as an icebreaker type topic, there are hundreds of fun facts and answers to frequently asked questions in this book. So assorted questions as to how did the European starling, an invasive species in North America, come to actually frequent our shores and become one of the most common species on the entire continent? Or more interesting questions such as how did the painted bunting receive its name, or trivia such as that. So I think that's a really fun thing for younger readers as well as readers of all ages to really break in and really understand some fun things to share at the dinner table with the family.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, kids are always so curious and are just always craving more information. So I think you're right. That's such a great way to get them even more engaged.
And that's so true. I think kids almost have this boundless well of curiosity and interest, and they can just absorb information so quickly. So I think for me, it's always about trying to equip them to understand the information as in as frustration free a manner as possible. Because I think
Mhm.
kids can get frustrated sometimes too when things aren't presented in a way that makes sense to them. So
Absolutely.
these books, in particular, Birds of Maryland, also includes my one-of-a-kind birding by comparison approach to identification. And this is my approach that I came up with, and it essentially allows you to identify birds by comparing them to those that you already know. So, for
Mhm,
instance, most people know about, let's say, 20 or 30 species that they're pretty well familiar with, like an American crow or a northern cardinal.
mhm,
And they might not be quite as familiar with some other birds that they could very easily see if they just know where to look.
hmm,
So, for instance, below I have pictures of both a northern cardinal, which is on the left, and a gray catbird, which is on the right. And the interesting thing is that these two birds, while the northern cardinal is very common and easily observable in suburbs, the gray
mhm,
catbird is also extremely common. It just happens to be more common in some of the thickets and wetlands we may not frequent quite as often. So if you look at these two birds, they're actually just about the same size. So we know what a cardinal looks like from various distances, but we may not know how a catbird appears. So if
mhm,
you almost superimpose a cardinal-sized bird that looks just as the catbird does in this picture on the right into a thicket, then you can almost visually sort of understand how that bird will look in the field before you've even seen it for the first time.
hmm,
So I think that's a very helpful visualization reference, as well as an easy to use aspect where all of the birds are actually sorted largest to smallest in the field guide. So
hmm,
you can actually flip through the book and say, okay, I saw a small bird and go to the small birds, or I saw a medium-sized bird that might be a little bit more like a large woodpecker, which is on the cover, the red-bellied woodpecker.
mhm.
So you can get a sense of almost how to identify these birds based on what you've already seen, as well as some helpful size and habitat references.
Yeah, that's so interesting and so helpful because I know so many books are maybe more organized by sort of genus or species and how they're related
Sure.
taxonomically. And to the average person, they might not know those things, or it could be, as you said, really frustrating. So the idea of using birding by comparison is such a cool idea. So okay, so that's the book. Super awesome, really exciting, and I could see it applies, it's engaging for everyone. So then what are some tips that you have for birding, such as like what to bring or when to go or what to wear? What do you suggest?
Well, I like that question too, because I think a lot of people are wondering about that. A lot of people are interested in birds, but they think it's this really difficult hobby to break into, or it's really expensive. And I think in times like this, where we have some economic uncertainty on the horizon, there's turmoil on the news every single day. I think nature offers a really wonderful retreat from all of the busyness of everyday life, and it's also a very inexpensive pursuit. So if you're a new birder, the two things I would recommend out of almost anything would be binoculars and then a simple backyard feeder station.
Hmm,
Now, binoculars actually are, you can buy a very decent pair of binoculars for less than $70.
hmm,
And in fact, when I was a very young child, I received my very first pair of binoculars, and they were only $5 from a local dollar store. And I used those probably for 10 years as I was growing up because I was just so attached to that particular pair, and I still have them today for demonstration purposes. And I feel that these binoculars, you can really see almost anything if you get just a very durable middle of the road pair of binoculars. And I typically recommend 7 to 8x magnification, so that's
hmm,
7 to 8 times, and that is a good balance between too high of a zoom or too low of a zoom. And I also think that, for instance, most people, at least their experience with birds is such that birds don't really pose for us to study them, and they are very skittish in the fields. So it's hard to
yes,
get close. It's hard to approach them. So if there's a bird, let's say your best shot might be getting within 60 feet of most birds. But if
right.
you have an 8x pair of binoculars, you can make that 60 feet seem almost like 8 feet. And
Hmm.
8 feet is just from one end of the sofa to the other. And then it's just like you're watching a documentary in your living room. It's just right there in front of you in all its beautiful clarity. So you can see the bill, you can see the chest, the belly, even the little feet. So that's such a beautiful immersive experience for so many birders. And then also the backyard feeders. I'll double back to that in a little bit, but I think that's a really accessible way for most people to do it. And for more hands-off parents, you give your child an inexpensive pair of binoculars, a back window, and a small little dedicated bird feeding station. They'll be out there for hours just trying to find all the different species. So I think that's a really rewarding prospect.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. We have a bird feeder near our kitchen window, and as we're eating cereal in the morning, it's like, "Ooh, who's out there today? What's
Sure.
going on?" So it becomes really exciting. So then, what are maybe some suggestions on where to go? So if you are venturing out of your house and going maybe specifically for birding, or maybe you're going for a hike and you're bringing your binoculars, where are some places that you found in Maryland that are good to visit?
Yeah, so as far as landmark destinations, if you're really looking for a family trip or a day trip or a weekend trip, I think Sandy Point State Park near Annapolis is a
Mm,
wonderful place to start. Lots of long-legged wading birds like herons and egrets, and those always steal the headlines. But in late fall through early spring, you'll actually have numerous migratory waterfowl that are coming through,
oh,
which is very, very exciting. I would also suggest Susquehanna State Park near Haverty Grace.
mhm.
That actually has a nice amount of preserved mature woodlands, which almost
Oh,
acts like a sponge for birds as they're migrating through in the spring and the fall. Because these birds are really famished. They travel as many as thousands of miles in some cases, and they're looking for the perfect place to touch down that has all of the seeds, the fruit, all the different resources they need to fuel their journey, the next leg of their journey. So that's a great place to find birds in migration and really all throughout the year as well. And then
so
finally, the
then
national.
just quick question, Mark, when you're
Sure.
talking about migration, are you really focusing on fall and spring? Are there particular months that maybe you're seeing more birds as they're moving through? Like it's normally the beginning of fall or the beginning of spring, or does it really depends on the bird?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I think there are typically probably two general groupings in terms of migratory patterns, but they can vary a little bit. So
Hmm,
that's one reason why I did why I did the monthly birding forecasts for each species because it can
totally.
vary, and that way you get a very definitive idea. But as far as those general groupings, I'd say that a lot of the songbirds, a lot of birds will come through in the spring and fall. So
Okay.
spring, they'll be coming up into Maryland, and that's typically from mid-April through early May.
Okay.
And then in fall, they'll be returning back down south, which typically is the period from mid-August to maybe early to mid-September.
Okay.
And
That's
then
helpful.
some of the waterfowl actually will begin to come south into Maryland starting in about early November, and then
Mm,
they'll be returning up north as late as about late March.
hmm. Okay. That's super helpful to know.
Yeah, so those are the real groupings there. And but as far as understanding where to bird, I mean, I have three locations listed here, but I really always recommend to start locally because there are
Mm,
usually so many spots locally that where you can find almost 90% of the birds you could at one of these landmark destinations.
hmm.
So you go find maybe a local park or a wooded trail, and those will have numerous songbirds, particularly during the migratory periods, but all throughout the year, really. And also, there are many ponds and small lakes and wetlands and all throughout Maryland, really. And those are great for waterfowl, wading birds like the great blue heron, which honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a child be more excited about seeing a bird when they first see a great blue heron because these birds are 4 feet tall. They snap up fish in the water, and it's just really, really a breathtaking spectacle for the kids. And in addition, I mean, the flycatchers, the kingfishers, the blackbirds, these small little wetlands areas offer so much in the way of wildlife and bird life. And then doubling back with a reference to suburbia, the backyard feeders are always an excellent opportunity.
Yeah, that's really helpful to remember to go local. I do think sometimes when we're thinking about wildlife, we forget about our backyard or even, just down the street or in the small patch of woods around the corner. So that is really helpful. So
Absolutely.
we were just talking about migration times, and we're now moving into summer. But that doesn't mean, we're bird free. There's tons of birds around in the summer. So I was wondering if you could tell us what we should be looking for this summer here in Maryland.
Yes. So the first bird is one that I'm sure most of the viewers will be well familiar with, and that's the American robin. Now, on the left, we have an adult robin, and that's, I think, what most people envision when they think about a robin. But right about in, let's say, April and May, the robins are starting to settle down and begin to nest. And those fledglings are starting to leave the nest about a month to a month and a half later. And just about now, you're starting to see some of the juveniles beginning to walk around the neighborhood, find their first worms, maybe trail along their parents, and they're not that much smaller than the adults in most cases. They just have this interesting plumage that's a bit different. So if you look at the photo on the right, they have a little bit of a mottled or a patchiness feature on their faces with the white and the black, but really on the underside in the chest, you'll find this beautiful white and black dotted or polka dotted even pattern with that orange. So it's almost like they're growing up into their full vest of beautiful colors. But I saw one on a walk last week, and really, I think it's almost like an Easter egg hunt for kids because behind
Oh,
every bush there could be an egg. Really, with these, it's every 50th or 100th robin could be a beautiful little juvenile that looks completely different than the rest. So I think that's a really cool thing to really be watching for. And they're most common from March to September in general, this species, but they're found year round. So this is a really great bird for the summer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on top of the American robin, common grackle isn't quite as well known, but I'd venture to say it's almost as common. So this is a really great bird to find if perhaps you haven't seen it before, but you're looking for an easy one to sort of add into your life list. And the common grackle is a little bit larger than an American robin. It has a long black tail that almost looks like a diamond at the very end of it as it's flying. So it's a long kind of diamond-like tail, and it has these kind of harsh check calls, check check, as it's flying overhead, and a very fierce attitude. They'll even almost fight with or chase away other birds at feeders. So if you have a feeder near long fields or even wetlands, you'll know this common grackle because they'll be invading your feeders just about this time of year, April, May, June. They'll be all over those feeders because they love raiding the grains and the seeds. But just about now, it's a great time. They can flock in groups of up to a couple hundred in some cases, and
Wow.
and they're very, very active. So it's quite an adventure to try to find them. And if you look at that picture there, the males actually have a lovely deep blue iridescent head. And that's an example of a great reason to buy even an inexpensive pair of binoculars, because the binoculars allow you to see that detail that you might not quite see from afar. But they are a staple of summer life in Maryland, that's for sure.
Really beautiful too. That's a stunning photograph. I love it's yeah, it's sort of bluish, purplish. They're beautiful.
They are, and it's those details that I think people forget. They're just driving past and they say, "Oh, it's another bird. It's another bird." But there's so
Right.
many different species in the state. I think there are 140 in my field guide, but I'd say out of that 140, 60 you could find within 2 or 3 weeks if you really wanted to look. And it's very, very approachable how many different species there are. And once you dive into the details, they're interesting behaviors, they're beautiful plumage and feathering. I think it's really quite rewarding, so rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to the next bird, this is one that a lot of readers will really appreciate, and it's the osprey.
Hmm.
And being that Maryland's really kind of centers around the Chesapeake Bay on the eastern half, the
Absolutely.
Chesapeake Bay is a fantastic place to go birding. I mean, I have family who actually lives on a canal that's connected to the Chesapeake Bay, and they'll have ospreys flying past their house on a daily basis. And with the ospreys, really what to look for is if you see on that image on the right, it's actually holding its wings in a shallow M shape
Mm-hmm.
as it's landing on that dock piling.
Hmm.
And they hold their wings in that sort of crooked or shallow M shape as they're flying. So you can almost see that as they're flying along. And they have that beautiful white and brown and a little bit of an eye line going through and that sharp raptor-like bill that we all know.
Hmm.
But interestingly, in both of these photos, you can see that he's actually eating a fish. So on the
Oh
left, he
yeah.
has a half-eaten fish, and on the right, it's much better preserved because he just snagged it from the water. But ospreys are fish-eating birds, so they will actually fly 60 to 80 feet above the water as they're sort of scanning below, and they can actually see into the water column several feet
Hmm.
from that height, and they'll plunge dive up to depths of about a foot as they're trying to grasp the fish to bring it back up. And they're they're so efficient with their eyesight and their movements that they're actually able to successfully catch a fish every third or fourth dive. So it usually only takes them about 15 minutes to grab a fish.
That's
And
incredible.
right about now, they've actually mostly situated their nests for the breeding season. Now, a lot of local Audubon societies will have lists of known breeding and nest sites,
Hmm.
but they're typically on high snags or high man-made platforms near the trees, and
Hmm.
they're within maybe a mile or so of a major waterway or body of water, like the Chesapeake Bay
Hmm.
and or the Potomac. And the osprey is really a wonderful bird to be watching as they're engaging in their breeding season from April through September, really.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And finally, this is a very recognizable bird for those who have backyard feeders, and it's a chipping sparrow. Chipping sparrow is a cute bird. It's very, very small, very petite, very small little black bill, and it has a funny little red chestnut cap on top. So if you're looking for the small birds, I've heard it so often. All the sparrows and finches, they all look alike, don't they? And they don't. There are actually 10 different species of sparrows that can be found in Maryland, and nearly just as many finches, and they all look just a little bit different. And this species here, it has a very clean, almost white underside, and it has that beautiful characteristic red or chestnut cap. And the chipping sparrow is known as such because of its chipping calls. It has this long series of high-pitched, almost insect-like trills, where it just trills for anywhere from 2 to 6 seconds, and it'll just trill up in the trees, and you can hear them all throughout your neighborhood, particularly as they're coming in April. And they're migrating in. But right about now, I would say that if you have a backyard feeder, you will be seeing these birds at least once every day or two. And they're very common at those backyard feeders right about now, and very common all throughout the suburbs too. So if you put up a feeder, they'll find your feeder within a couple of weeks. So they're very inquisitive, very fun, and very petite for the children to find. So very fun bird. One of my favorites.
Okay, Mark. So before we go on, I have to be honest with you. I love birds and I love birding. And I do it fairly frequently, but I'll be honest, I struggle with sparrows so much. So this might be a really easy lob for why to buy your book. But like you said, there's 10 species of sparrows in Maryland. So there are a lot, but I, for the life of me, really struggle with identifying them. What should I be looking for? How do I really differentiate between the different species?
Sure. So each species, if there are any similar species, I have a small section where it says compare to similar species, and I explain
Okay.
exactly the field marks to look for as to differentiate them. But with the chipping sparrow specifically, a lot of sparrows have a streaked underside, and the finches too, to some extent. So they'll have dark streaking on the underside, and it's kind of like a tan with a brown streaking or something like that. That's what you'll often see with the sparrows. The chipping sparrow has a very clean white underside. It's almost two-toned with this kind of mottled brown on the wing and on the back, and then this clean white on the chest and the belly. So you look for that clean white underside and then that little chestnut hat. The red chestnut hat, really among summer sparrows in Maryland, is very unique. So I would focus on that red hat and then the clean white underside for the chipping sparrow. And it's just those little details, and you spot them once, and then you know it for your rest of your life. And I think it's equipping people to find those little details, and then you have it down.
Totally. Totally. I feel like we just need to go out one weekend and you need to tell me all those things. But then again, I feel like that's just buy my book, Janet.
It's a
So
little
that's
bit of
really
both. It's
helpful.
a little
That's really helpful. Okay. So being a specialist on Maryland birds, what are some things that Marylanders should know? Like what makes Maryland so unique? And we talked a little bit about this already, with the Chesapeake Bay, but why is Maryland an interesting place to go birding?
Well, I love Maryland in particular because it has a nice, really diverse mix of habitats. So, like I mentioned about Susquehanna State Park, there are a lot of nice preserved tracts of mature woodland. But with parts of land that have actually transitioned from fields or agricultural use, or even edges of suburbs, they're actually transition. Those are known as transitional or successional woodlands,
Hmm.
where the trees are beginning to sprout up, and they have a lot of thickets, some fields interspersed in between, and there's a really nice mix of any range of woodland all throughout the state of Maryland. So that's a great first point, because some birds only prefer the patchy woodland that's just regenerating, and others prefer the 100-year-old woodlands, and it's a
Hmm.
really nice mix.
Hmm.
You mentioned the Chesapeake Bay, and I think the Chesapeake Bay and the Oceanic Coast is a really significant hallmark for the state. And like I mentioned, if there are about 140 species in my book, Birds of Maryland. That would probably be 120 or 125 if it weren't for the Chesapeake Bay. So there
Hmm.
are a lot of species that are specific to the Oceanic Coast, and that's their bread and butter as far as their typical diet, their breeding behaviors, their habitat, just everything. So that I think the Oceanic coastline is something Marylanders should be really proud of, and I think they are already. But that's a great place to bird.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, in addition, there are a number of inland lakes, reservoirs, and waterways. So the ponds that dot the landscape, those are all really great places to find a wide variety of blackbirds, kingbirds, kingfishers. That's a really great opportunity, and those really dot the landscape, which I find is pretty neat.
Hmm.
In addition, in Western Maryland, on the Panhandle, you have a bit of Appalachia that descends in from the mountains, and I think that is a great place to find some of the more high alpine birds, or birds that typically prefer coniferous forest, which
Hmm.
means pine or spruce, those types of forest. And whereas the dark-eyed junco actually is a winter sparrow all throughout Maryland. In the Western Panhandle, it's actually found year-round because it has
Hmm.
adequate breeding habitat in that section of the state. So I think that's a really, really sort of an underrated gem of Maryland's ecology. And then finally, the abundant parkland and walking trails. Out of there, I've visited so many states now, and I think Maryland has a really well-developed park infrastructure. And there are
Mm.
so many places where you can just have a nice time walking on a paved path, and there are a wide variety of wetlands, suburban or scattered woodland habitats. I think that's a really great feature as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I Maryland's small, but we're mighty.
That's right. That's right.
So then thinking about kids specifically, do you have any suggestions on how to engage children in birding?
Sure. So whenever I speak with younger birders or new birders, I always mention to focus on the most common species, and then you branch out according to your interest level. So
Mhm.
like I mentioned earlier, there are probably about 20 to 30 species that are really super common that you could find in a single day, almost guaranteed, if you just went to just around your local community. And I think maybe that's where you start because I think
Mhm.
kids sometimes can get a little bit frustrated if they are unable to sort of get that validation or that confirmation immediately. And if you really zero in on, let's say, the mourning dove or the American crow or maybe a mallard, that's a great way to get them interested. So they see it in the field, they get that sort of backup validation after having learned it at home,
Mhm.
and that's a really great way to do that. Now, in addition, my book actually includes dedicated frequency ratings for every species. So if you look closely on the bottom there in that screenshot, there's a small number to the left of where it says mourning dove. And I
Mhm.
have one of those numbers inside a circle for every single species page. And that essentially is a 1 to 5 rating of how easily found that bird is in the entire state of Maryland. So for the mourning dove, it's a very common bird. So it's a 5 out of 5.
Mhm.
So if you were to go through my book and maybe round up some of the 5 out of 5 birds, the most common birds, you could pretty easily make some flashcards or even just show your kids the full page, full color photos and then just get them to learn those birds. And then they can branch out if they really like the warblers or if they really like some of the sparrow species that we were mentioning earlier.
Mhm.
Just kind of zeroing in on their interests and letting them lead the way. And I think that's always a really wonderful way to keep it going and keep it help it almost blossom into a lifelong passion.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Those are some great tips. So we had talked a little bit already about backyard bird feeders, but we've only sort of touched on it briefly. Could you just speak about backyard bird feeders and any sort of tips or tricks that you have with setting one up and making some of the choices that go around with them?
Sure. So a well-designed feeder setup can actually attract over 50 species every single year. So I think that's something that always really shocks a lot of listeners because they're always thinking, oh, they're probably only 10 or 20. You can actually pretty easily get over 50 in a single year.
That's crazy.
And my typical recommendation for a very basic setup, really that could even cost you less than $50 or $60 on the front end, would be setting up a squirrel-proof tube feeder. Now they make some tube feeders that are actually squirrel-proof, where they're weight sensitive, so the squirrel triggers it and they can't access the seed. And that's a great way
Oh.
to prevent waste and also unwanted pests around the house. Even though I love squirrels, not everyone shares my passion, so I'm sure to acknowledge that. And in that photo there, that's an example of a tube feeder. It's a long tube with small little holes and then perching opportunities for the birds. And on there, actually, that's a downy woodpecker. So a downy woodpecker is actually the most common woodpecker in the state of Maryland.
Hmm.
Now, another great feeder is a platform feeder. So typically they're made out of wood and they're sort of a tray. And you can either hang them from a branch or you can mount them directly on a ground mounted pole. And the platform accommodates some of the ground feeding birds that can't really fit on those small perches, like maybe a mourning dove or even a blue jay that's pretty large.
Hmm.
So platform feeders are a great way to round things out. And then also suet cages as well. Now, if you're a little bit more adventurous, you can actually buy one of those blocks of suet that fits in the suet cages. And instead of putting it inside the cage, you can rub it directly on the bark of the tree
Huh.
yourself. And that's something that I actually personally do. And I found that it makes the suet a lot more accessible to a variety of birds, and they
Huh.
seem to appreciate it a little bit more in my personal setup. But regardless, suet actually attracts a lot of woodpeckers and nuthatches that you can't really find quite as often because they actually are tree clinging birds. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of foliage and leaves between you and the bird. So it's a little bit trickier to find them unless they're in the open at your feeders.
Hmm.
So I think suet is a real slam dunk because woodpeckers, I think, are an endless fascination for so many birds.
Definitely.
Now, in terms of other possible feeders, hummingbird feeder is pictured here below. Hummingbirds actually are about the size of a large dragonfly, and they can flap their wings 40 to 65 times per second. So you can't even see the wings, they're going so fast, and they can hover in
Amazing.
place. They're really, really unique birds and fun to watch. But the hummingbird feeder tends to be a little bit more difficult to maintain. I typically recommend replacing the sugar water inside about 2 to 3 times a week in hot weather because it can
Okay.
quickly ferment and make the birds very sick.
Hmm.
So that's a little bit trickier. So in addition, I'd say a thistle feeder with Niger seed inside is helpful for finches. Sometimes they call them sock feeders. And
Hmm.
they really look like long tubular socks that have small little openings so the finches can grasp the sock and then reach their bills inside for the fine seed.
Hmm.
Again, that only really serves house finches, goldfinches, pine siskins, birds like that. So it's not
Hmm.
quite as well rounded. So I don't typically recommend that as a first feeder.
Hmm.
In addition, you can do a small tray. I actually use a lid from a peanut butter jar, and
Hmm.
I actually place that on a tree branch, and that works pretty well. And you can put some mealworms, dried mealworms, or even grape jelly or orange slices, and that
Huh.
branches out and allows insect-eating birds with the mealworms, or actually frugivorous or fruit-eating birds with the grape jelly and orange slices. Um,
Huh.
so if you have a mockingbird or an oriole that you've been seeing around your backyard, throw some grape jelly or orange slices out there, and they might visit and really give you quite a fun time. And then finally,
That's very
hanging seed
strange.
bells are a good opportunity for chickadees, titmice, woodpeckers, but they can be
Hmm.
a little bit expensive, so I don't always recommend those.
Okay. That's helpful.
And then finally, I guess a few pitfalls and maybe some tricks. I typically recommend situating bird feeders about 12 to 18 inches apart. Having them too close together can actually stress the birds a little bit, and you don't want to
Hmm.
stress them when they're feeding. They like to have at least a little bit of protection, a little bit of space when they're feeding, just I
Hmm.
suppose as we all do. I remember, being in high school many, many years ago, and we were all crowded on those long lunch tables, and no one has enough space. Birds don't like that either, so you want to have them just a little bit apart. And then, in addition, you want to make sure there's plenty of nearby shelter. So if you have your bird feeder set up near actually shrubs, trees, brush piles, that allows the birds to seek shelter in the immediate vicinity of your feeders. So
Hmm.
many birds will actually live a lot of their day in a semi-confined area. So if they know that there's well-defined shelter space near your feeders, some of them may just sit in the shelter and sit at your feeders and just go back and forth all day, and that's their entire day.
Huh.
And the more
Wow.
shelter opportunities you have, the more birds are likely to visit your feeders. So that's a good
Hmm.
option. Finally, I have actually spoken on this a bunch in the past. Keeping your feeders 25 feet away from any nearby windows is a great reminder because hundreds of millions of birds die each year due to preventable window strikes.
Wow.
So you keep them too close to your windows, and for the bird, they don't have experience with windows, and they just see inside your kitchen and they think, "Oh, that looks like it could be a beautiful place to find some more seed," and then they don't experience the window until it's too late. So I
Hmm.
think keeping it just far away enough, that's a really, really important thing. And then
Hmm.
finally, cleaning your feeder regularly, typically once monthly, is my recommendation. That's a great way to prevent the spread of avian disease.
Hmm. That is really, really helpful, Mark. That's a good reminder too, because I know in Maryland there was some challenges with birds and disease, and now it looks like that's possibly was due to the cicada emergence that happened this time last year. But again, it was
Absolutely.
a good reminder that we really needed to make sure that we take care of our bird feeders and keep them really clean. So that's really helpful.
Yes, and I remember that as well. So that was a great, great example.
Yeah, it was so bizarre. It was such a strange, strange thing that happened, but it was like, oh, well, nature, this is how it rolls. You're always learning new things.
And we just have to figure out how to play our best part as we're just a segment of their lives. We want to be the best
Right.
part of their lives we can be. So
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mark. That was really, really helpful. So Marc Parnell is author of his new book, which is Birds of Maryland, but he has many, many guides in the Birding Pros series, including Birds of DC. And actually, really briefly before I let you go, Mark, if you could just talk, because you have lots of books of different states. So because our viewers live all over Maryland, could you speak just really briefly about the differences between Birds of Maryland and Birds of DC?
yes, so there is a little bit of overlap between Maryland and DC. I typically recommend DC for those who live in the greater DC area, such as in Bethesda or Chevy Chase. Also, really up into the southern Baltimore suburbs as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you live in that Baltimore, Washington, DC corridor, I typically recommend the DC book because that includes greater DC as well. But if you live throughout the rest of the state of Maryland, I think Birds of Maryland is a really well-rounded reference guide, and it includes all those Chesapeake Bay birds as well.
That's super helpful. Yeah, it's we live in a funny state.
It's a
Uh,
beautiful state all the same.
well, thank you again so much to Marc Parnell. And thank you also to all of our viewers and listeners and to our sponsor, Annapolis Pediatrics. Make sure that you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in both video and podcast format. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.